Maria Santos was mopping the executive floor at 11 p.m. when the CEO burst out of the conference room, papers scattered across his desk, and desperately asked the night janitor if she spoke Portuguese. What happened next would save his company from a $30 million lawsuit and change both their lives forever. Before we continue, if you enjoy incredible true stories of unexpected heroes, make sure to click that subscribe button. This is the best way for you to support our work. Thank you very much, and let's continue. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Maria wrung out her mop for the 100th time that night. Her hands, weathered from years of cleaning chemicals and long hours, moved with practiced efficiency across the marble floors of Hartwell Industries. At 34, she had been working the night shift for 3 years, arriving at the downtown office building every evening at 9 and leaving just as the morning rush began. The routine was always the same: 43 floors to clean, 6. Different types of surfaces, requiring different cleaning solutions, and approximately 270 offices to maintain before dawn. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid enough to cover rent on her small apartment and keep food on the table for her 8-year-old daughter, Isabella. Every morning, Maria would arrive home just as Isabella was getting ready for school. She would help her daughter with breakfast, check her homework from the previous night, and walk her to the bus stop before collapsing into bed for 5 hours of sleep. The cycle repeated endlessly. Sleep, wake up to pick Isabella up from school, help with homework, prepare dinner, ensure her daughter was settled for the night, then head back to work. Weekends meant catching up on laundry, grocery shopping, and trying to spend quality time with Isabella, despite the exhaustion that seemed to live in her bones. Maria had come to the United States from Sao Paulo 12 years earlier, with dreams that felt impossibly distant now. She had been a literature teacher at a prestigious private school in Brazil, fluent in Portuguese, Spanish, and English, with a degree in Portuguese and English literature from the University of Sao Paulo. Her students had loved her passion for words, her ability to make classic texts come alive, and her innovative teaching methods that blended traditional analysis with modern interpretation techniques. She had published several academic papers on Brazilian literature and had been working toward her master's degree when everything changed. The economic crisis that hit Brazil in the early 2010s had devastated the education sector. Private schools closed, public school budgets were slashed, and teachers found themselves competing for positions that paid barely enough to survive. When Maria discovered she was pregnant, and Isabella's father, a fellow teacher who had promised to stand by her, instead disappeared without a trace, she faced an impossible choice: struggle in a collapsing economy with a newborn, or take the leap to America, where her sister Carmen had already established herself as a nurse in Phoenix. The decision to leave everything behind had been the hardest of her life. She sold her small apartment, her books, her car, everything except what could fit in 2 suitcases, and used the money to pay for immigration lawyers and the complex process of obtaining a visa. Carmen had warned her that her Brazilian credentials would mean nothing without expensive American certifications, but Maria had believed that her education and experience would somehow translate. The reality proved harsher than she had imagined. The executive floor was always the last stop on her route. While most of the building emptied by 7, the top floor often stayed active well into the night. She had learned to work quietly around the important people in their expensive suits, becoming invisible as they discussed deals worth more money than she would see in several lifetimes. Tonight felt different, though. There was an urgency in the air, voices raised behind closed doors, the kind of tension that made her stomach knot with familiar anxiety. Richard Hartwell, the company's 52-year-old CEO, had been pacing his corner office for hours. Through the glass walls, Maria could see him running his hands through his graying hair, phone pressed to his ear, occasionally slamming his palm against his desk. Hartwell Industries was in the middle of the biggest acquisition in company history, a deal to purchase a Brazilian manufacturing company that would expand their operations into South America. The contract, written in Portuguese, had arrived that afternoon, and they needed to respond by morning. Their usual translator had fallen seriously ill, and every translation service they contacted was either unavailable or couldn't guarantee the overnight turnaround they desperately needed. The deal was worth $200 million, and any delay could mean losing it to their competitors. Worse, initial reviews suggested there might be concerning clauses buried in the Portuguese text that their basic translation software couldn't properly interpret. Maria was carefully dusting the conference table when she heard Hartwell's voice crack with frustration. "There has to be someone," he was saying into his phone. "Anyone who can read this properly. We can't sign something we don't fully understand, but we can't afford to lose this deal either." She had always prided herself on being invisible, on doing her job without interfering in the world of business that surrounded her. But something in his voice reminded her of her own desperation, the nights she had spent staring at bills she couldn't pay, the weight of being solely responsible for her daughter's future. Before she could stop herself, Maria knocked softly on the office door. Hartwell looked up, momentarily confused, to see the night janitor standing in his doorway. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. "I'm sorry," he said, clearly distracted. "Could you come back in an hour? We're dealing with a crisis here." Maria's heart hammered in her chest, but she forced herself to speak. "Excuse me, sir," I couldn't help overhearing. "You mentioned needing someone who speaks Portuguese?" Hartwell stared at her for a long moment, as if he couldn't quite process what she was saying. "You speak Portuguese?" "Yes, sir. It's my native language. I'm from Brazil." The silence stretched between them as Hartwell processed this information. Here was his night janitor, a woman he had barely noticed in 3 years, offering to help with the most important business deal of his career. Everything about the situation felt surreal, but desperation had a way of making the impossible seem reasonable. "This is a very complex business contract," he said slowly. "It involves technical language, legal terms. This isn't just conversation." Maria straightened her shoulders, feeling the weight of her abandoned dreams. "I was a literature teacher in São Paulo before I came here. I have a degree in Portuguese and English literature. I understand complex documents." Hartwell's expression shifted from skepticism to something resembling hope. "Would you be willing to look at it? Really look at it? I could pay you for your time, of course." Maria nodded, not trusting her voice. This was either the opportunity she'd been waiting for, or a mistake that could cost her the job she desperately needed. Hartwell led her to the conference room where thick documents were spread across the polished table. The contract was indeed complex, filled with technical specifications, financial terms, and legal clauses that would challenge even experienced translators. But as Maria began to read, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the familiar thrill of intellectual engagement, of using her mind for something beyond routine maintenance tasks. The main terms of the deal were straightforward. Enough. Hartwell Industries would acquire Metallurgica Torres, a mid-sized manufacturing company based in Porto Alegre, for $200 million. The Brazilian company produced specialized metal components for the automotive industry, and their established relationships in South America would give Hartwell immediate access to new markets. But as Maria worked through the document, translating OEM clause by clause, she began to notice subtle inconsistencies in the Portuguese text. Her academic training had taught her to read between the lines, to recognize when authors used ambiguous language deliberately. This contract felt like a complex piece of literature designed to obscure rather than clarify. The first red flag appeared in Section 7, where the ownership structure of Metallurgica Torres was described. The Portuguese used passive voice constructions that made it unclear who actually controlled various aspects of the business. In Brazilian legal documents, this kind of linguistic sleight of hand often indicated complex ownership arrangements, designed to limit liability or hide assets. As she continued reading, Maria began taking detailed notes, creating a parallel document that tracked every questionable phrase, every ambiguous reference, every place where the Portuguese text seemed deliberately opaque. Her years of literary analysis had trained her to notice patterns, and a disturbing pattern was emerging. The technical specifications section contained another concerning element. While the main contract discussed the acquisition of manufacturing equipment and facilities, buried within the technical appendices were references to equipamentos compartilados, shared equipment. This suggested that some of the machinery being purchased was actually jointly owned with other entities, meaning Hartwell Industries might not be getting full ownership of assets they were paying for. But the most troubling discovery came in the environmental compliance section. The Portuguese text mentioned responsabilidades, ambientais existentes, existing environmental responsibilities, but the phrasing was so convoluted that it was impossible to determine whether these referred to current compliance status or inherited liabilities. In Brazil's complex environmental regulatory landscape, this distinction could mean the difference between a clean acquisition and inheriting decades of environmental violations. Hartwell sat across from her, occasionally asking questions, but mostly just watching this woman he had never really seen before transform into someone completely different. Gone was the quiet janitor who moved through his office like a ghost. In her place was an intelligent, articulate professional who handled his company's most important document with the same care she brought to cleaning his floors. "There's something wrong here," Maria said after 2 hours of careful review. She pointed to a clause buried deep in the contract's financial section. This paragraph talks about empresas asociadas, associated companies, but the way it's written, it's not clear if these companies are part of the acquisition or separate entities. Hartwell leaned forward, his fatigue forgotten. "What do you mean?" In Portuguese, there are subtle ways to imply ownership without stating it directly. This clause suggests that when you buy Metallurgica Torres, you might also be assuming responsibility for debts and obligations of other companies that aren't clearly identified, companies that could have significant liabilities. Maria's finger traced the problematic text as she continued. And here, in Section 12, there's another issue. The word they use is responsabilidades. In English, you might translate this as responsibilities, but in Brazilian legal language, it can also mean liabilities or debts. The way this sentence is constructed, you could be agreeing to take on unknown financial obligations. Hartwell's face went pale. How much unknown liability are we talking about? Without knowing what these associated companies are, it's impossible to say. It could be nothing, or it could be tens of millions of dollars, but the contract is written in a way that makes it very difficult for someone reading an English translation to understand the full scope of what they're agreeing to. The implications hit Hartwell like a physical blow. If Maria was right, and he had signed this contract without understanding these clauses, his company could have found itself responsible for debts and obligations that would dwarf the value of the acquisition itself. The deal that was supposed to secure their future could have bankrupted them instead. "Are you certain about this interpretation?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Maria nodded gravely. "I've read this section 5 times to be sure. The Portuguese is deliberately confusing, but the implication is clear. This isn't just a translation issue, it's a fundamental problem with the deal structure." Hartwell immediately called his legal team, waking lawyers and executives across 3 time zones. By dawn, they had confirmed Maria's interpretation and begun emergency negotiations with the Brazilian company. The supposed associated companies turned out to be shell entities carrying over $30 million in environmental liabilities and outstanding lawsuits. The revelation sent shockwaves through Hartwell Industries. Emergency board meetings were called, senior executives flew in from regional offices, and the company's entire legal department began working around the clock to understand the full scope of what they had almost agreed to. The Brazilian sellers, when confronted with Maria's analysis, initially tried to dismiss her concerns as misunderstandings, but when faced with Hartwell's team of lawyers armed with her detailed breakdown, they were forced to acknowledge the accuracy of her interpretation. What followed was a tense week of renegotiation. The Brazilian company claimed that the associated liabilities were minor and manageable, but their own legal team's reluctance to provide detailed documentation suggested otherwise. Private investigators hired by Hartwell discovered that 2 of the shell companies were facing major environmental lawsuits related to groundwater contamination, while a 3rd was involved in a labor dispute that could result in millions in backs, wages, and penalties. The original deal had been structured as a simple acquisition, with Hartwell assuming all assets and liabilities of the target company. Maria's discovery revealed that this would have included assuming responsibility for these hidden entities and their massive potential liabilities. The environmental issues alone could have resulted in cleanup costs exceeding $50 million, while the labor disputes carried potential penalties that could have bankrupted the Brazilian operations before they even began. The revelation completely changed the dynamics of the negotiation. Armed with Maria's analysis, Hartwell's team was able to restructure the deal, excluding the problematic entities and reducing the purchase price to reflect the actual value of the assets they were acquiring. What had started as a potentially catastrophic hidden liability became a negotiating advantage that saved them millions. But the real transformation was just beginning. As word spread through the company about how the night janitor had saved them from a disastrous deal, Maria found herself in an impossible position. She was suddenly visible in a way that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. The executives, who had never acknowledged her existence now, wanted to know everything about her background, her qualifications, her story. Hartwell called her into his office the following week. This time, she wasn't carrying a mop. "Maria, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Why are you working as a janitor when you clearly have the skills to do much more?" Or, the question she had been dreading finally came. How could she explain the complex web of circumstances that had led her here? The immigration challenges, the language barriers, the economic pressures, the simple reality that employers saw her as a cleaning lady rather than a former teacher. "When I came to this country, I had a daughter to feed and no American credentials. Cleaning pays immediately. Teaching requires certifications I couldn't afford to pursue. I did what I had to do to survive." Hartwell was quiet for a long moment. "The board has authorized me to offer you a position in our International Business Development Department. You'd be working on contracts and communications with our Latin American partners. The starting salary would be $60,000 a year, with full benefits and opportunities for advancement." Maria felt the floor shift beneath her. $60,000 was more than twice what she made cleaning offices, enough to move Isabella to a better school district, enough to maybe think about dreams again instead of just survival. "But I don't have American business credentials," she said, the caution of years hard to overcome. "You have something more valuable than credentials," Hartwell replied. "You have intelligence, integrity, and the ability to see what others miss. Those aren't things you can teach." The transition wasn't immediate or easy. Maria had to learn new software systems, understand American business culture, and navigate office politics while fighting the imposter syndrome that whispered she didn't belong in conference rooms with people who had master's degrees from prestigious universities. The first few months were particularly challenging as she struggled with business terminology she had never encountered and corporate protocols that seemed designed to exclude rather than include. Her new colleagues' reactions varied widely. Some welcomed her expertise and were genuinely impressed by her linguistic abilities and cultural insights. Others remained skeptical, viewing her as an affirmative action hire who had gotten lucky with one contract. She heard whispered conversations, questioning whether the night janitor could really handle complex business negotiations, whether her success had been a fluke rather than a demonstration of genuine competence. Maria threw herself into learning everything she could about international business law, trade regulations, and corporate finance. She spent evenings after Isabella went to bed studying online courses, reading business journals, and practicing presentations in front of her bedroom mirror. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was once again staying up late to work, but now she was building a career rather than just paying bills. Her linguistic skills proved invaluable almost immediately. The company's previous approach to Latin American markets had relied heavily on translation services and consultants who understood the language, but not always the cultural context. Maria could spot not just mistranslations, but cultural misunderstandings that could derail negotiations before they began. She understood the difference between formal and informal address in Spanish, knew when certain Portuguese phrases carried emotional weight that wouldn't translate directly, and could navigate the complex social protocols that governed business relationships in different Latin American countries. But she had advantages her colleagues didn't. She understood the cultural nuances that could make or break international deals. She spoke the languages of their new markets fluently, and she brought a perspective shaped by real hardship, rather than theoretical knowledge. Her experience as an immigrant, as a single mother, as someone who had worked with her hands as well as her mind, gave her insights into human nature and business relationships that couldn't be taught in any MBA program. Her first major success came 6 months later when she identified another problematic contract, this one with a Mexican supplier. The company had been negotiating to purchase automotive parts from a manufacturer in Guadalajara, and the preliminary agreement looked straightforward to the American legal team. But Maria noticed subtle references to maquiladora regulations that suggested the Mexican company was operating under special trade zone rules that could complicate importation and potentially violate certain American trade agreements. Her analysis prevented what could have been a costly legal battle with both Mexican and American trade authorities. More importantly, it established her reputation within the company as someone who could see problems that others missed. By the end of her first year, she had been promoted twice and was leading the company's expansion into 3 new Latin American markets. The financial impact on Maria's family was transformative, but the psychological impact was even more profound. For the first time in over a decade, she could make decisions based on what was best for Isabella's future rather than what was necessary for immediate survival. They moved from their cramped 1-bedroom apartment to a 2-bedroom place in a better neighborhood with good schools and a small yard where Isabella could play safely. But perhaps the most significant change was in Isabella, Maria's daughter, who had grown up seeing her mother leave for work each night with cleaning supplies, now watched her leave each morning with a briefcase. The transformation in how Isabella saw her mother was remarkable. Where once she had been somewhat embarrassed to explain her mother's job to classmates, she now proudly announced that her mom was a business executive who helped her company work with other countries. Isabella's own academic performance improved dramatically as well. With the financial pressure reduced, Maria could afford tutoring when Isabella struggled with math, could buy her the books she wanted to read, and could even consider extracurricular activities that had previously been financially impossible. The 8-year-old who had once worried about whether they would have enough money for school supplies now talked excitedly about wanting to learn French so she could help her mother with even more international business. The ripple effects extended beyond their immediate family. Maria's sister Carmen, who had initially worried about her decision to take such a dramatic career risk, watched in amazement as her little sister transformed from exhausted night worker to confident business professional. Carmen began encouraging other immigrant women in their community to pursue educational opportunities and professional development, using Maria's story as proof that it was never too late to reclaim abandoned dreams. The evening shifts at Hartwell. Industries continued, but now they were filled by someone else. Sometimes, when Maria worked late on a particularly challenging project, she would see the night cleaning crew making their rounds. She always made sure to acknowledge them, to thank them for their work, remembering how invisible she had felt for those 3 years. On quiet nights, when the executive floor was empty except for her, Maria would sometimes stand at the window of what had once been Hartwell's office and was now hers, looking out at the city lights below. She thought about the literature classes she used to teach in Sao Paulo, about the dreams she had carried across borders and through years of struggle, Those dreams hadn't died. They had simply evolved, adapted, found new forms of expression. The contract that had changed everything now hung framed on her office wall, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that opportunities often come disguised as ordinary moments, that competence can exist in unexpected places, and that sometimes the most important qualifications for success are the ones that can't be measured on a resume. Maria's story became part of Hartwell Industries' culture, told to new employees as an example of how talent can be found anywhere if leaders are willing to look beyond traditional expectations. The company implemented new policies for recognizing and developing potential in all employees, regardless of their current position. But for Maria, the most meaningful change was simpler and more personal. She could now help Isabella with her homework without the distraction of wondering how they would pay next month's rent. She could plan for her daughter's future instead of just managing her present. She could be the mother she had always wanted to be, the one whose daughter never had to worry about whether her dreams were affordable. Years later, when Isabella graduated valedictorian of her high school class with a full scholarship to study international business, she would credit her mother's example as her inspiration. Not just the dramatic story of the contract that changed their lives, but the quieter lesson of a woman who had maintained her dignity and intelligence through years of work that others dismissed as menial. The janitor who translated a contract had become the executive who built bridges between worlds, who understood that business was ultimately about people understanding each other across barriers of language, culture, and assumption. Maria Santos had saved a company from a $30 million mistake, but more importantly, she had saved herself and her daughter from a life limited by other people's narrow definitions of worth and potential. In the end, the most valuable. Translation hadn't been from Portuguese to English, but from invisible to invaluable, from survival to success, from the margins to the center of a story that proved ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when given the chance to show what they really know